Kia ora, iti whanau. Today we're going to be reading from a Waitangi report that was generated as part of the Whanganui River Inquiry in the late 90s and early 2000s. This report is the Southern Whanganui Cluster Traditional History Report. It's been authored by David Young, who is Pākehā, and it was published in July of 2007. This report was commissioned by the Crown Forest Rental Trust, and that trust funds basically all Waitangi research. So when you make a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, you can then apply to the trust for funding to fund your research into your Waitangi claim. Now we're going to start with the introduction of this book, and I'm just going to read it to you. If you've got a disclaimer I'm going to give to you about our Waitangi reports is these are predominantly compiled by claimants. Claimants have an interest in the outcome, and the content that sometimes goes in here is not 100% accurate, or is often one-sided, and there's lots of omissions. There's a few disclaimers that I'll read through in the introduction that will help you understand that. So my recommendation to you is, if you are reading this material or listening to these videos, don't take everything these books say for gospel, but absolutely take the content of these books to your kaumātua and see what your kaumātua have to say about the kōrero in here. Your hapu and iwi might have a variation of this story or might have a completely different story altogether. And it's important that all of those stories are shared and heard for us to capture the fullness and beauty of who we are as iwi Māori. All right, we're going to start with the project brief and the introduction. The commission for this document is to prepare a traditional history for a number of the 15 hapu and interest groups of the Southern Cluster, Whanganui region, defining the groups in their rohi, identifying issues of traditional or cultural importance, and setting the scene for an understanding of what has been lost through the actions of the Crown, remembering that Waitangi claims are based on grievances with the Crown. This includes identifying founding ancestors and discussions of where they exercised their customary rights and tended their ahika, coverage of hapu migration to the Whanganui area, the acquisition of rights there, and relationships of hapu and iwi of the Southern Whanganui district. The brief is also to include information on how the tupuna of the groups shared and distinguished resources and areas of interest, information on cultural life of the hapu and how they interacted with the landscape, including their relationship with the Whanganui River and tributaries and lakes and estuaries. Traditional stories and perspectives, the political landscapes and leaders and the extent of their mana, and how the New Zealand wars involved and affected hapu dynamics, and how rapid land loss after the wars affected hapu in terms of mana, tikanga, social and economic life, are also a part of this brief. Personal. This is about our author. David Young is an historian who works on the relationship between people and the land. He has written much on the subject of conservation since 1970, including with Māori on their history and environmental issues in a number of books and projects. In this regard, his most relevant publications are Faces of the River, Matahina Power of the Land, Woven by Water, Histories from the Whanganui River, Our Islands and Ourselves, A History of Conservation in New Zealand, and he was a writer for the television series and book Frontier of Dreams. David has been involved in several Waitangi Tribunal cases, including the Te Whanganui o Orutu Y55 and preliminary work for the Wakatohia and Ngāti Rongo o Wakata. He wrote the social impact history for the Te Tau Ihu and the report on contested wahitapu between Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Maniapoto. His most recent works are Whaiō, Saving New Zealand's Blue Duck, and The Keeper of the Long View, a parliamentary commissioner for the environment and sustainability. He is immediate past president of the Professional Historians Association, New Zealand Aotearoa, and a long-time board member of the World Wildlife Fund, and a trustee of Ngāti Koata's Spineback Trust. Acknowledgements. First, the hapu of the Southern Cluster, whose history and hospitality it has been my privilege to share. In particular, I wish to thank tangata whenua Bill and Mike Portaka, Morven Simon, John Maihi, Anne Waitai, Ken Clark, Greg Ratana, Chris Shenton, Des Canterbury, and those others who gave oral histories and other assistance, including Haimona Rozoska, Phil Ponga, and Rangipo and Judith Medekingi. Paul Meredith has provided valuable translation research assistance. The Alexander Turnbull Library Archives New Zealand, the Whanganui District Library, the Whanganui Regional Museum, and staff at the Crown Forest Rental Trust, including Anita Miles and Hinamore Awatere, are also gratefully acknowledged. Apart from the difficulties of examining traditional history through the murky lens of 200 years of colonisation, the logistics of this operation are such that material from minute books has necessarily been selective. And this is part of that little disclaimer I was giving Whanau. These reports were produced to enable full and final settlements for hapua and marae. So they just wanted to get the business done. They're not too concerned about being correct, comprehensive, or even fair in some of the kōrero. So if there's anything that I read in here that you absolutely don't agree with, I'd love to hear from you. There's an awful lot in here that I don't agree with, which is why I've started reading these things. The Waitangi Tribunal has created all sorts of opportunities for bad things to happen for our hapu and marae through these processes. So part of my purpose in sharing this information is so that we might know when misinformation has been published about our hapu and our rohe. The logistics of this operation is such that material from minute books has been necessarily selective. Now, this is a big concern because minute books are testimony from court cases, and as we know, when people are in court, they don't always tell the truth. And to be selective about minute book references, that you may be pulling references that reinforce an untruth. And I know that's actually happened. Sometimes boundaries have remained uncertain, history is clouded, and in a few cases, little information has been found about particular claimants. So this is where the author is telling us himself that the information may not be correct. So let's move on. It is also important in compiling a traditional history in respect to tapu, silence, and mystery. Part of this is expressed by Ngā Pairangi elder Morven Simon, who gave openly of his knowledge, but also spoke of the need for people talking of Pairangi to respect the tapu associated with his name and who he was. Apirana Ngāta most noted that he encountered it in gathering the songs of Ngā Mōtiatia. It even has a name, Te Iwi Kaipono, meaning reserved. Now this part here, unfortunately, creates a grey area in which some people have chosen to live. The ambiguity is helpful to them when they are not telling the complete truth about things. Kaipono is a term that you'll hear a lot in relation to treaty settlements. The claimants. The claimants included in the Southern Whanganui cluster include Y180, Howard Brooks and others, Ngāti Pāmoana concerning Koroniti school site, Y214, KT Mea, Parekino block, Y505, Te Aroha and Waitai, Ngāti Tamarihi roto, Waitotara, Kaiwi and Motua Gardens, Y584, Kenehi Robert Mea, Ngāti Hiniaro, Ngāti Tuira, Paitawa block, Y655, Ngāhina Matthews, Whanganui Rangatike blocks, Y671, Kenehi Robert Mea, Hapu of Tūpoho Whanganui, Whanganui Groundwater, Y978, Y979, Kenehi Robert Mea, Ngā Hapu of or Tūpoho, Te Tūpoho Whanganui Lands Purchase, Y999, Manuka Waiki, Taitoko Medekingi and another, Te Poho Matapihi Trust, Whanganui Block Lands Reserves, Y1107, Sharon Maraku, Ngāti Hine, Ngāti Ruai, Ngāti Te Waikarapu, Y1028, Bill Ranginui and another, descendants of Hinionioni, Te Tuhi Block, Y1051, Kenneth and Clark and another, Ngā Pairangi, loss of lands through native land court, Y1070, Ben Robert Potaka and others, Ngāti Tuira, Hiniaro, Ngāti Pamoana, Ngāti Tinionioni, Y1105, Rangimari e Wirimu Kawika, Moses and another, Ngāti Kawika, Upper Waitotara region, Y1143, Te Kenehi Robert Mea, Ngāti Hiniaro, Ngāti Tuira, Y1202, Whanganui River Trust Board, no claimant, Y1254, Haimono Rozoska, Ngā Potama Claims Committee and the Matahiwi Marae Committee, and descendants of Potama. Ngā Potama Nui a Awa's rights and interests in the Ngā Potama a Awa Rohi, Y979, Rangi Wakatika, Ho and another, Ngāti Ho. It should be noted that not all agreed to their histories being included. Ngā Wairiki, Tamarihi Roto and Ngāti Kawika, as well as Ngāti Tuira, Ngāti Hiniaro and Te Korowaia, Te Awa Iti and the Whanganui Trust Board are part of this claim, but are not part of the traditional history. Their histories will be submitted separately. Now, I've read that part out to you, Wano, so you understand that those people that I've mentioned are the only ones that have contributed to this report. Okay, we're going to start in chapter 1. Boundaries. In 1938, Kaumātua Hikinui Wakarake, in the application for investigation of title to the bed of the Whanganui River, gave the boundaries of the Whanganui tribe as commencing at Taipake at Kaiwi on the coast, thence to Mangapapa, thence to Puketotara Block, thence it follows the ridge to Wakai Huwaka, thence it runs to the boundary of Taumata Mahui, thence along the boundary to Rako Atiatua, a hill, thence to Witianga, thence to the boundary of Marae Kowai, thence to Remiputa, thence to Te Horongopai at Taringamutu, thence to Komakoiti in Ohura south, thence to Pukeho Block, thence it crosses the Whanganui, thence along the Wakapapa River to the boundary of the Waimarino Block, and the junction with the Mangahuia River to its source on Ruapihu. Thence O Wahitotara, thence it follows the Waimarino County boundaries to Wangaihu, thence to the mouth of the Whanganui River. As the Whanganui Tribunal's 2002 report on boundaries for Whanganui reported, there is considerable overlap between the interests of Whanganui and Ngārauru, and both appear to have interest in the Whanganui and Kaiwi purchases and in the Waitotara and Kaitangi Whenua blocks, if not others. They also note a definite overlap between Ngāti Apa, Ngā Waiariki and Whanganui. The author has not been able to detail these boundary issues in this report, the claimants having chosen to progress such work themselves. Other internal boundaries within the cluster are raised where claimants have been able to discuss them, but generally at the time of the completion of this report, in a number of cases, these were not able to be discussed. Historiography. The difficulties of attempting to reconstruct a deep past of an orally based culture that has been colonized for 200 years ought not to be exaggerated, but there are a number of challenges to which an outside historian needs to be alert to from the outset, and this is where he is again framing the difficulties that they have of getting it right. The first is found with all oral histories of this nature, and this includes such European traditions as those of the Nordic Beowulf narrations. The problem is aptly alluded to by Professor Judith Binney in this way. By the transmission of knowledge orally over a long period of time, early ancestral figures were gradually transmuted into tribal deities, or atua. As the details of experience became blurred and lost, the early Pacific voyagers who reached Aotearoa, New Zealand, and settled the land entered into the twilight of memory, losing many of their human attributes and becoming reinvented and recalled in narratives as atua. This is evidenced by Karihana Taho, who in 1869 stated at a hearing Pairangi was an atua, and by Toa Kahuru 10 years later, He Pairangi was a mythical ancestor. When impacted by Western culture in the Māori ways, Whanganui culture has been When impacted by Western culture in the ways Māori culture has been, a number of effects bear down on the traditional history. The influence of new diseases, new religions, written culture, and other radically different ways of life together contrive to weaken, if not sever, those traditional lines of thinking. While Māori culture generally proved resilient to many of these influences, it is a truism that the transmission of traditional culture suffered in ways and on a scale that is being described for numerous indigenous cultures subjected to colonisation and modernism. The second process, which also has been widely documented, is that in order to adjust to the impact, Māori attempted to accommodate the changes by modifying their culture and modifying the new in turn. So it is often suggested the combined conflicts of Christianity and the cultural threats it posed were resolved in the syncretic Pai Mārire movement. More pertinent yet to this discussion is the authors of papers to the Journal of the Polynesian Society look back on the race they believed was doomed to extinction. Its contributors encouraged knowledgeable Māori to set down the traditions from whence they had come. One of those most influential contributors was Watahoro Juri of Ngāti Kahungunu, who lived for some time at Whanganui. The question that modern scholars Māori and Pākehā ask of this process of writing down ancient Māori history is, to what extent did Māori amend their knowledge to accommodate the expectations of their questioners? The writer acknowledges that whakapapa is fundamental to any understanding of Māori society and history. It establishes not only a sense of position in terms of time, space, and continuity in a seamless flow of tupuna, it is the root of mana and its constant relation, tapu. It is, of course, derived from a knowledge system that was orally, not text-based, and each line of whakapapa given is given at different times for a particular purpose. And this is what makes whakapapa so confusing and so cool. We should also acknowledge that many whakapapa are still transmitted orally, and many written whakapapa have been buried with their owners for fear of tapu. Finally, it is noted that whakapapa is ever a taonga not lightly given and received in similar spirit for the purposes of giving direction and purpose to a document such as this. An attempt has been made here also to use the Māori newspaper resources within the Alexander Turnbull Library, some of which date from the end of the New Zealand Wars. Even when published as late as the 18th, early 20th century, however, they can help cast light back on the culture and times of the tupuna of the peoples of this claim. Percy Smith. In his discussion on the Whanganui people having acknowledged the Aotea canoe, Percy Smith suggests that the Kurahaupua waka was also a contributor to the population. Percy Smith suggested that, did he? Smith then enters the realm of tangata whenua, and I quote, "One of the principal tribes is called Ngā Pairangi, and it is believed that Pairangi, from whom the people take their name, was one of the tangata whenua. He flourished about 21 to 23 generations ago, and many families of rank trace their descent from him." Smith then gives the quote from Elsden Bess, with which many Ngā Pairangi still concur and to which they refer. Though all the Whanganui people say that Kupe on his arrival here found only the Te Waiwaka, Te Eke and Kōkako birds, with no people, yet when questioned closely, the old men of the valley admit the existence of the tangata whenua in the valley of Whanganui. Still citing Best, Smith suggests that Pairangi predated the Aotea canoe by 5 generations and that he arrived by Atua. He had no need of a canoe. Aokihu, slayer of the great destructive Taniwha Tūtai Poroporo, is usually said by Māori to be the grandson of Turi and brother of Ruaputahanga of Taranaki, who married Whatihuia of Tainui. However, from his Ngārauru perspective, Ruku Broughton argues that Aokihu is not a descendant of the Aotea canoe, but was tangata whenua from the Kāuirere people. These are the flying people, a persistent tradition about which there is further discussion later. Best offers another tradition of Aokihu, namely that he crossed Cook Strait to take a wife, Tākaka Mātua, of Arapawa Island. He spoke of the foods of his district, namely kahawai and dried kumara, and later available when the kao kumara was at its most fragrant, a sensation particularly notable offshore of the Turakina and Waitangi rivers. Ngā Pairangi are also mentioned as the numerous people living in the Whanganui Valley as far as Opiriki near Koroniti and extending to Wangaihu. The sphere of influence of Pairangi and that of his eponymous tribe was considerably more extensive than it is today. Of course, as always, and as we shall see in matters tribal, the wairua of Pairangi continues to breed in these descendant tribes. The most bold and assiduous of the modern revisionists was David Simmons, who was among those who challenged the tradition of the seven canoes established by S. Percy Smith. Shortly after publication of his work, a thesis of Luca Broughton brought the same kind of questioning into events and territory that occupy part of the claim now before the tribunal, namely the interests of groups to the west, namely Ngāti Tamariki Roto and Ngāti Kaueka. In the time available for research, it was not given to traverse the provenance of most of the ancient traditions of the Whanganui people. That's a really concerning disclaimer, that one is, because the author is basically telling us he didn't have time to double check that the stories were true. What is possible is to bear in mind both the cautions issued and the findings made by those who have devoted years to such questions. Both Simmons and Broughton, each well informed, the first to Pākehā, the second to tangata whenua, are instructive. Simmons suggests a number of ways in which written traditions need to be tested. None of these is surprising, and this document need not repeat them. He also lays down the criteria for authentic tradition. He says that it must be indigenous, apart from the law of pre-European social group. Maori's fishing up of the North Island, which is the earliest recorded and is widespread, is a perfect example. One might add that it is also consistent with wider Polynesian depiction of the god's character. Second, he says that oral tradition must not be the tradition of one man, such as Te Kōti, nor should it be the combination of traditions. Fourth, it needs not to be contaminated by stories from other tribes. Now, I quite like that statement there, because he's telling us that we should be listening to multiple versions of each story, and we should not be homogenizing those stories to try and get one basic story that captures them all. We need to preserve the variations of the kōrero and where those variations come from to maintain the richness and beauty of our whakapapa and kōrero tuku iho. In as much as possible, these are the criteria. One could say that to a Māori scholar they are self-evident, which I have attempted to follow with varying degrees of success. Again, telling us that he hasn't necessarily been able to make sure these kōrero are correct and true. I have read only the English translation of his thesis, but Ruka Broughton, who fully discloses his sources, reveals how, from a Ngā Rauru perspective, older, pre-Aotea traditions have been almost eliminated. He believes largely in the late 19th century. He makes a useful contribution to the shared histories of the ancient Ngā Rauru traditions and those of their neighbours, who make up part of the Southern Cluster claimant group. It must be added that the Whanganui continues to uphold its special knowledge from antiquity in Waitangi on the river, schools that are not open to anyone other than tangata whenua. We get but glimpses of this other life on the river, and it would be unwise for an outsider to do other than allude to it, which is what follows briefly. Ngāti Kahungunu scholar Juane Ture Watahoro Jury's contribution has in recent times been examined by Peter Clayworth in his PhD dissertation. It is not easy to summarise briefly such a large and thoughtful work. In light of Watahoro's influence on Smith's accounts of the Whanganui region, a few lines, however, in his abstract are useful to this discussion, and I quote, Smith's writing on the Moriori myth have been shown to have been largely based on his interpretations of the writings of Te Watahoro. It will be argued that the Moriori myth was in fact the creation of interactions between Pākehā scholars and the Māori experts, rather than the invention of any one person or group. Clayworth's chapters 5 and 6 are especially pertinent to this discussion. There are other Whanganui sources to which scholars continue to return, such as Kōringa Tūwakia, whose material was given to Elsden Best by courting his son, Kirihoma tu Wawakia. Horipuki Hika is another vital source, as is Werimukauika of Ngārauru, who recurs as a source throughout this document. Three of the main contributors to the Europeans writing on Māori in the Journal of Polynesian Society are Smith, Best and Downes. If they are not drawing on these sources personally, they are sharing them. Downes, because of his many years working on the river with the Whanganui River Trust Board, had access to many other sources. Kirihoma tu Wawakia is a named source for the well-known poignant lullaby written by a childless woman for the dressed wooden doll she made as a representation of her son, cloaked with albatross feathers in its ears. It also appears with a different gloss, but from the same original source, Te Ao Tariwa, annotated by Pei Te Hurunui Jones, quoted in part. E tama e tangi nei kei te kai maho. Kaore he kai he wangainga māku I a koe. Ko te rāheri nana I kai te anga o te marama. Ko te wai toki hirangi. Kai te wakarongo au e tama ki te korero I ngā whenua. I heke mai anō I a tamatia. Kai uiuia I te manaia I te hora a mōhau uruhia tomokia I te rupe o huriwaka. Oh, my son, crying for your food, I have no food to give you. I, you, grandma, am alone, O son. 'Twas te rāhiri who ate the shell of the moon, hence the stealthy waters from the sky. I am listening, O son, for talk from afar, that we also are descended from tamatia. If you are questioned at Tamania or Te Horo o Moiho, open and enter you into Te Rupi or Huriwaka. Both these last references Smith believes were to ancient houses of learning. The first stanza refers to Rua Mano, often named and described by Smith as a whale taniwa, to Tarihuku, which are the narrows on the rangitike below Aorangi, where Tamata Pokai Whenua was presented with preserved bird by Ngāti Hotu chief Tarinuku. Two landmarks, Tauakira and Oromo Papako, fishing orientation marker hills near Whanganui, are also mentioned. Tauakira, a significant landmark for the people of Mangawedo, will recur in this narrative. I come from Tauakira and Mangawedo. Since the early Polynesian Society membership was both small and active, the Māori sources used are referred to and passed around by all those writing in the area. Best, Smith and Downes being those main contributors into the journal in this region. They are also the sources which are lodged by these same people in the Alexander Turnbull Library, to whom writers such as Symonds have returned. Most of the secondary sources relevant to this project, often cited by Māori and others today, are carried in the notes and references. Smith, Downes, Best, all contributors to thinking within the rohe under current examination, are in this category. However, writers such as Houston and Buick are not always as explicit as to sources. The result is that the account of the famed ads, Te Awhiorangi, for example, which is mentioned in the Journals of the Polynesian Society and also in Houston, appears too in Roger W. Hardy's Koroniti booklet. We have almost no way of knowing whether these two accounts represent parallel streams that converged centuries before in a common source, or, and this is unlikely, whether Hardy, who was Pamoana himself and advised by the greatly esteemed Kaumatua based at Koroniti Rangipokiha, simply adopted Houston's account originally published in the 1960s. A reference to the ads also appears in Tai Tukirau Waiata, cited by another great and more recent scholar from the Upper River and the late Pei Te Hurunui Jones, in which it is bound into one of the great traditions of the Whanganui region for its entire length. In dealing with history in the North Island, there is one other matter which Judge Eddie Jury referred to 20 years ago. This is the constant references one encounters to the tangata whenua, not today's people of the land, but to those who came, settled and were living here when those of the named canoe traditions arrived. When discussing such matters with senior Māori from Muokoko to the Bay of Plenty, it is impossible to avoid the beliefs and traditions that there were people here before the major migrations. John Grace, in his sometimes criticised book, Tu Ware Toa, discusses names and even describes these early people in ways in which, on this matter, even critics of his appear to take no issue with. Grace's extensive description of an early physically distinctive people, Ngāti Hotu, is widely corroborated. Hillary and John Mitchell touch on these matters in their recent published work on Te Tau Ihu, even bracketing Pairangi, the ancestor, with Ngā Tūpaha, a name we suggest may be a variant of the ancient Waitaha people. Waitaha still carrying their name on the lower river pa, just a short distance from Whanganui City. The Mitchells place Ngā Pairangi as early occupiers of Arapawa Island, excuse me, and the Marlborough Sounds, throat chakra. Indeed, Ngā Pairangi hold in their possession a select taonga, a mereponamu, which dates from the time when, after dwelling for some many years at Arapawa Island and heading back to the Whanganui region, some Ngā Pairangi were presented by their island-dwelling kin with a gift pair. Many years later, in the time of the great-grandfather, Haimona Rosca says that both were buried at Waitangi on the Tokomaru block. The message was, in time they will come back if they are needed. Many years later, a farmer out pig hunting found the taonga uprooted. He wanted to sell them back to the Kaiwaiki people, who chose not to buy them from him because they were theirs already. However, eventually they did purchase back one at auction. Wakarewarewa. Haimona says that there is a fragmentary waiata that goes with it. Many a wild goose chase has been embarked upon in the quest for proof positive of the existence of the maru iwi. I do not believe that a traditional historian's task is to discount and dismiss such narratives out of hand, more especially when contained within the evidence of living kaumātua. Without belabouring these accounts, they need to be acknowledged. And sadly, I have seen that sometimes people will wait for someone to die before they publish their version of the kōrero because they know that kaumātua would have disagreed with them openly. Indeed, in the case of the Southern Cluster, it is my view, and that of some of those I have been able to talk with, that such traditions may deeply inform the less controversial histories that follow. Simmons suggests that Taranaki was not seriously colonised by Ngā Roru and Ngāti Rauanui until the 17th century, for which he cites Smith's Taranaki coast. But how can this be if the famed ancestor Alkehu is seen as being Ngā Roru and Whanganui 5 generations before Aotearoa's arrival? Haimona Te Ao Te Rangi, aka Tiki Kānara, suggests that Alkehu, like Potama, comes originally from the Mōkau area, and Alkehu is one of my tupuna. Interestingly, Simmons spends less time on the Aotea traditions than he does other waka, and his work predates Broughton's efforts to reclaim the ancient traditions of his Ngā Roru people, which show how Ngā Roru is embedded in early stories from Southern Taranaki traditions. While Simmons' thesis has much to say about movements of people within New Zealand, once voyaging waka landed on these shores, it is fair to say that in the region in which we are concerned, the pre-waka traditions engage him little. Manu Mirakingi also makes the telling point that much traditional history was usually passed on to the eldest sons. More often than not, I'm supposed to say something about that. The patriarchal angle that often permeates modern publications regarding iwi Māori, I have to disagree with that because I know in our hapu and iwi, it was often the wahine that were the storytellers and the wakapapa holders, and not the tāne. More often than not, it was they who fought in the 2 world wars and too often never returned. These stories are often buried with them on foreign shores, dying for a crown whose response was far from reciprocal. Invariably, their hapus are the losers in more ways than one. There is another point to be made here. History and archaeology, indeed all the chronological disciplines, are always at the mercy of what remains. It is impossible to write about what is not held either in documentary evidence or tribal memory. To that extent, history is inevitably partial. For some groups, more than for others, and sometimes deliberately. Traditional histories. Long ago, Maui Tikitiki and his brothers went fishing and hauled up Te Haha Te Whenua, the fish of Maui, the North Island. So mighty was this fish that Maui returned immediately to Hawaii for help, leaving his awed brothers to safeguard it. In their fear, they approached Whanganui, who told them, "The mana of Te Ika Maui can be subdued only by a greater mana. I give you Matua Te Mana Ruapihu." This volcano rising skywards in the centre of the new land brought much-needed tranquility. But there was a problem for Ruapihu: loneliness. And it was Ranginui who noticed. Ranginui laid 2 teardrops at Ruapihu's feet, one of which was to become the Whanganui River, and the other becomes a story for other tribes to tell. But Ruapihu's sorrow deepened. He pleaded with Ranginui for companionship, and in time Ranginui sent him 4 friends: Tongariro, guardian of the 2 teardrops, and Taranaki, custodian of the tapu for the clan of mountains. There was also Naruahoi, the servant of these mountain masters, and finally Pihanga, the mountain maiden. Pihanga was spoken for as Tongariro's bride and the future mother of the continuing line for the mountain enclave. However, Pihanga was tempted by Taranaki, eventually heeding the advice of his mountain brother Ruapihu. Taranaki wisely but sadly left the enclave. It was the only way he could ensure his tapu remained intact. Taranaki took the pathway that many mortals would later follow down the course of the Whanganui River. At a western point in the river, he struck out towards the coast, settling by the ocean as the guardian of the setting sun. Here he remains within view of the line of mountains of the central uplands from whom he stands to exile, and the Whanganui River continues to flow from Tongariro to the sea. Pairangi and Te Kāui Maunga, the flying people of the volcanic region, are held by Whanganui Kaumātua to be the original people of the Whanganui district. Greg Ratana and Morven Simons speak of the Te Kāui Maunga as being part of the Kahui family on the mountains, to which Ngā Pairangi and Ngātirangi are closely connected. Having no waka, they had the capacity to fly and spread themselves from Tongariro down the Whanganui River to its mouth and into its adjacent catchments, the Waitotara and the Wangaihu rivers. These connections across the region are both ancient and continuing. In these links may even lie the origins of the practices still alive when Europeans first came, of the Whanganui River mouth's use by all of the Whanganui southern hapu for fishing and mahinga kai. And conversely, and in a more dispersed manner, there was another pattern of movement on a seasonal cycle to the uplands, where everyone had access to plump birds of early winter. Pairangi was here at the same time that the Wānoa Apanui were in the Bay of Islands, in the Bay of Plenty. He is the second of 3 brothers, Tāiri and Pōkena being the Tuakana and Taina. They are known as a fighting unit really bested in battle. Tāiri, being a tall man, often challenged opponents to mortal combat in water. As a student of learning, Pairangi was given the teachings of the most venerated tohunga of those times. He was also so popular with women that finally he had to leave Hawaii. Left on a mountaintop surrounded by guards, he was able to escape by trickery, which is where his flying fame originates. Ngā Pairangi spokesman and John Maihi speak of 3 tupuna in Ngātirangi: Rangituhia, Rangitautia, and Uinuku. The Uinuku name is also in Ngāti Tuwharetoa Wakapapa. Uinuku is Uinuku Manawawari, who were foundational. Ngātirangi say that these 3 are the offspring of Taiwari, female, a descendant of Pairangi. But before them was their ancestor Pairangi, who, also having no canoe, was an indigene who spread himself right up the river. Downs supports the idea that early Ngā Pairangi were a numerous people living in the Wangaihu Valley as far up as Opiriki near Koroniti, and extending to the Wangaihu at the same period. He appears to be quoting using almost the same words from his correspondent and elder, Elsden Best. The Ngā Pairangi originally occupied the river of Whanganui, in fact the whole country from Wangaihu to Opiriki, Corinth. They were here when Aokehu and the ancestors of Te Ati Hau came from the north. In his assertion that Pairangi connects over the East Coast, Maihi is also supported by Beeston Downs. Maihi says that the East Coast Whakapapa link is, and I quote, to Aitanga a Mahaki. We have a connection and also back over to the East Coast, back to Whanganui Apanui. We should take the line from Pairangi number 2. I think a great-great-grandson, so that's the level that we work through from this period of time. I think we can link just about everyone to it, and of course Pairangi number 2, and going across his older cousin, brother, also had the family from Ngā Pairangi coming down from that line, and it ends up with the family from Ngā Pairangi. The people of Kaiwaiki are down the other line. From all those people, just about everyone in Whanganui and probably the lower Taranaki and even the lower Rangitike is of a descendant of Pairangi or Te Maungaroa, a common ancestor. The other side of Te Awa, Ngā Pairangi, Ngāti Tuira, Ngāti Pāmoana, I believe Ngā Waitangi is part of it. Haimona Rozoska of Ngā Potama stated, according to our history, the original Pairangi is from Hawaii. The East Coast associations may arise from later associations. However, the point made by Maihi Ratana that Pairangi was foundational is supported by all those who contributed to this traditional and customary report. It is confirmed over and over in the minute books. Just going to plug in the charger. Wainui Arua. To return to the teardrop narrative, one teardrop in the story above became the Wainui Arua, later the Whanganui. The other story for other tribes to tell, hence the meaning of the term, the waters of the two beginnings. Pairangi is the key to the river region's human history. Best gives 4 other names for the Whanganui: Te Wainui Arua, Te Wainui a Tarawera, Te Kaura Putaroa, Te Waitahu Pārai. Ko te ingoa tūturu o Whanganui ko te Wainui Arua. The proper name of the Whanganui is Te Wainui Arua. Sometimes the term Wainui Arua has been dismissed as an Edwardian invention which was encouraged by the late Gregor McGregor in the context of a club rugby team. However, the persistence of this term in sources such as Best requires a little more examination. It is also referred to by Ngāti Tūwharetoa as a name that preceded the Aotea. It is still held and given by Tūhoi and others as an old name for the Whanganui. Haimona Rozoska, a tribal authority on Wakapapa, affirms that it is indeed an old name. Ngā Tamarihiroto believe it is a pre-Aotea name, in the same way as the river Pātia Nui Aturi was once Te Wainui a Taikehu, after Taikehu who married Kurereia, daughter of Kupe. Tamarihiroto say that Wainui Arua is named for the ancestor Ruatipua who preceded Turi by some 18 generations, or maybe 450 years before the Aotea. I am an uri of Iti and Pukeko who are the children of Tamarihiroto, and that makes me uri of Tamarihiroto also. This considerable span is almost exactly the same number of generations as Broughton, one of the few local tangata whenua to bring written Wakapapa to light, gives between Pairangi or Te Maungaroa and Major Kemp, Te Rangihiwi Nui. Te Rangihiwi Nui, Major Kemp, was first cousin to my 2 times great-grandmother. Clearly, if Wainui Arua is an old name, then it does add weight to the idea that the arrival of the Aotea Waka was by no means either the beginning of the exploration or even a settlement in the district. Best also offers yet another traditional way, not unknown in other parts of these islands, in which the river was perceived, likening the Whanganui to a canoe. The head of the river is the ihu, prow, the middle of the river is the riu, hull, and the mouth of the river is the rapa, or quay, stern. We're up to chapter 2, beginnings. The story of the Whanganui iwi often begins with legendary Polynesian navigator Kupe. Kupe was an early explorer whose pursuit of a giant cuttlefish, a form of squid, brought him far south from home to these islands. On his return north, he passed up the North Island's west coast, staying a while at the mouth of the Whanganui. In this district, he gives his name to Te Kaiho or Kupe, or Kupe's landing place at the mouth of the river, because of the constant winds there. This may be an indication of why the river valley, rather than the more open parts of the estuarine plain, was the preferred choice for more permanent habitation by the river people until possibly as recently as about 200 years ago. Again, a name from one of Kupe's men, Paua, lives on, conferred after a tragedy at least 800 years ago when he drowned crossing the Whanganui River. Hence, Ko Arapaua, Paua, who was unable to cross 80 kilometres upriver. There's another version of the Arapaua kōrero in a book called The Whanganui Story, and it tells us that when Arapaua was swimming across the awa, because ko means to swim, he was in trouble. He was visibly in trouble, and Kupe stood on the bank and yelled out, "Ko Arapaua, swim!" And that's how the little stream Ko Arapaua got its name. Some accounts suggest that Kupe heard the calls of weka, kōkako, piwakawaka, but we are told he did not find any people on his upriver journey. And I quote, "The first beings in this land were birds, te waiwaka, fantail. Those te waiwaka belonged to Ruatapu. When they increased in numbers, they were set free to travel the world. They came to this land. Afterwards came Kupe, who saw those birds. When Kupe returned, he told Ture that there was no men in this land." Did Kupe see people? Kupe returned to the river mouth and then made his way to Pātea, South Taranaki, where he planted kumara and karaka seed in its sweet soils. From this story arises the belief, doubted by botanists, that the karaka is an introduced specimen. Percy Smith says that the kumara, when dried, could be carried in its natural state as kao over greater distances. Best suggests that though all the Whanganui natives say that Kupe only found the te waiwaka and the te eke or kōkako here, yet when questioned closely, the old men admit the existence of tangata whenua in the valley of Whanganui. These were the ancestors that came from Hawaii some 5 generations before Aotea. Brought hither by his atua, he had no canoe. There were 3 pairangis, one came in Aotea. With the exception of the Aotea reference at the end, which contradicts the Kāuirere tradition, this view is widely held within Ngā Pairangi. Pairangi o te Maungarua is the name given by Ngā Pairangi to the ancestor Pairangi o te Warituka of the House of Stone. This is a recognised Ngāti Rangi name. On his return to Hawaii, Kupe described his discoveries to the people. Sometime later, Ture, who captained the Aotea canoe, sailed to New Zealand, eventually to Pātea, making it his home. Some traditions tell that his descendants discovered the original people of the land, Ngā Pairangi. Their eponymous ancestor, Pairangi o te Maungarua, was said to have preceded Ture by 5 generations, which might be part of the interval of time between Kupe and Ture's arrival. However, the spokesmen are united that Rangipo Merikingi put it, he was brought here by his atua. He had no canoe. Ture and Ngā Pairangi. So when Ture's people arrived, Ngā Pairangi was already here. Ture's people dispersed from Aotea and came to Pātea, and others came to the Whanganui area, reflects Haimono Rizoska of Ngā Pautama. Break up our goddess mother, break up the ancient goddess earth. We speak of you, O earth, but do you not disturb the plants we have brought hither from Hawaii the noble. It was Maui who scraped the earth in heaps round the sides in Kurato. I te reo Māori, ngā ere, te waka tipua, ngā ere, te waka tāuito, ko koe kei wangairia mai I koe. Te taru ki Hawaii, tiki tiki, ko maru āhua te papa, I kirutau o. This is a time-honoured song chanted by Ture's people while digging the plantation, Hiki Hiki I Papa near Pātea, translated by Sir George Grey. Greg Ratana quoted the waiata Norunga about Ture and his rangitaapwhi. Normally, when you go out, That's a waiata that all Aotea could sing and not just Ngāti Ruanui or Ngāroru. Nō runga mātou o rangitawhi nei, eti iwi Māori o runga Aotea. Ko tia taha tira iu mai ai I. Āturi o rongorongo me te wānau hoki. Ka tū tana ware ko Waitangi rei. Kakaria tana puna para ki te uru. Ko hiki hiki papa te mara āturi. I toaua ki reira ngāhua o te whenua. Ki ringa o papa whiro ka taua te karaka. Hei maua ki nei, I te tini mokopuna. Hei pānui atu ki ngā iwi o waho. Ki te wai paunamu ki te wai paunamu ki te tai rāwhiti, ki te tai tokirau, me te hauauru e. We are from upon Rangitahi, your descendants of Aotea. This was the place of arrival of Turi and Rongorongo and the family too. His house was built and named Matangere. His spring was dug and called Parara ki te uru. Turi's garden was named Hiki Hiki I Papa, and 'twas there that the seeds of the ground were sown. Above Papa Whiro, the kariki berries were sown and retained by the generations of descendants for distribution among the people all over. To the South Island, East Coast, to the Northland and the West Coast. Greg says that the song was composed by the Ngāti Ruanui people for the dedication of the Turi Public Memorial in Pātea. Being well known by Pātea people and still sung today, as it is about Aotea and Turi, it is appropriate for all Aotea to sing. Although it starts at Rangitahi, that's where all Turi's descendants come from anyway. Tūtanga Te Kino is one of the protective taniwha that accompanied the Aotea on its voyage from Hawaii to Aotearoa. He was said to be the most dreaded taniwha of the river, dwelling at Piti Piti Aurangi. In 1984, the author was privy to a detailed account of the encounter with Tūtanga Te Kino. This was related by the Ngāti Haua elder Titi Tihu, from a time when, as a youngster in the late 19th century near Ohura, he travelled on the river at night and encountered the taniwha, guardian spirit of the tribal ancestor of the upper river people, slicing through the river towards him. Much of the awe in which this taniwha is held stems from its association with the Aotea waka, which it accompanied on its journey out from Hawaii. Two great eyes came at him like the signal lamps of the great Pākehā fireboats that were hauling their way further and further upstream. However, the taniwha had come to guide, not to molest him, so Titi was suggesting his life proceeded, always in close contact with his tupuna and his kaitiaki. In Old Manawatu, T. Lindsay Buick writes of Turi bringing not only kumara and karaka to the new land, but also a species of fern tree, live edible rats in boxes, tamepukiko, and some green parakeets. This account is also taken from Sir George Gray's translation of Pirikawa's account of the Aotea published in 1880. It includes Wakatawaki, Aotea of Great Cargo, the name of both the baler, Tipua Horonuku, and the paddle, Koutu Kitirangi. There are many details in this account, which is the sighting of Pōhutukawas in bloom, telling us that they landed north of the Ohiwai Mount Taranaki botanical line. There is a similar account, but with less detail, from the great Pūtiki chief Hoani Wiremu Hipango, given to Richard Taylor. The Turi story is undoubtedly the prevailing view for most of the people of the Taranaki region. However, Ngā Wairakei Tamarihirota and Ngāti Kauika contribute to early post-waka traditions. Ngā Wairakei to the immediate east of the Whanganui River are based on the Wangaihu, Mangawero and Turakina rivers, and their kaumātua believes that Ngā Wairakei have lived in the era Maira Noa. There are parts of the Kahui Maira Noa and are part of the Ka Uirere traditions. Tamarihirota and Ngāti Kauika to the west in the Waitotara River Basin, part of the Ngāroru, have traditions that are quite early, if not ancient. These will be explored largely by the claimants themselves, but it should be noted that it is Ngā Pairangi centred today at Kaiwaki whose eponymous ancestor has no tradition of a waka, such as his lineage. This foundational ancestor carries waka papa that runs for generations before the arrival of named waka, together with their relatives near the mountains, Ngāti Rangi, and their immediate South Taranaki relatives, Ngāroru. They too hold the surpassing traditions of the Kāuirere, the flying people. He, even more than the traditions of twisted braids, to which we will come, unites the Whanganui people fundamentally and indisputably. Maungaroa, sometimes formerly suffixed to the first Pairangi's name as Pairangi or Te Maungaroa, is also important because this refers to the very early traditions of not only Ngā Pairangi, but also Ngāti Rangi, who still reside beneath Ruapehu. Kāui Maunga are mountain people closely related to the Kāuirere. According to Best, their first point of origination in New Zealand is on the east coast. The fires of Pairangi are said to have been sighted by Kupe, as Morven Simon observes. When Kupe came into their land, he stayed here for a little while. He went as far up as Kauarapawa, where his slave was lost. He was about to lay claim to the land when he first arrived here, but he saw smoke from the ahi ka and said, "Kaua ka ke te ahi." The fires of occupation have already been lit. The collective name for the people of the river, Te Ati Hau, is in some versions said to have derived from Haupipi. He sailed with Turi on the Aotea after his original canoe, the Kuruhaupo, was wrecked. His name is a contraction of Te Ati Hau Nui a Paparangi, the people of Hau Nui a Paparangi. Hau Nui a Paparangi also arrived with Turi, and his descendants settled among the people of Ngā Pairangi. Hau is usually regarded as the ancestor of Ati Haunui, a Paparangi, the overall name of the Whanganui people. What follows is Percy Smith's understanding, the first part of which is corrected from Ngāti Hau to Ati Hau by Haimona Razoska. Te Ati Hau is another tribal name of Whanganui, and indeed is sometimes used for the whole of the tribes of the river. This name is derived from Haupipi, who was one of the immigrants who came by the Aotea canoe in 1350. He was the ancestor who is said to have given names to the principal places on the coast between Patea and Wellington, as embodied in an old song composed by Te Rangitakoru of Ngāti as an oriori, or lullaby, to his daughter, as follows. And we, our ancestors, came also in the Aotea, the famous canoe of Turi, that landed at the mouth of Whenuakura, where the house was built and named Rangitahi. There was sown the kumara and the karaka seed in this land of light first seen, and pillars set up to the female offspring, left in the charge or dedicated to the sisters, Nonoko Uru and Nonoko Tia, bound at top with woven belt. Then Ho, taking soil in the land in one hand, together with the staff of Turua, went forth on his journey, giving names. First he crossed the river, and from its sides called it Whanganui. Then next he dipped up water and called it Whangaihu. However, if there were people here prior to the man Ho, they would have had different names for these rivers, namely to the south the Whangaihu and Turakina, also the Mangatwero, which was collectively referred to as Wairiki, and from which Wairiki takes their name. These names then have been displaced by later waka traditions. McEwen, using the translation by Pei Te Hurunui Jones, Te Rangitakoru's lullaby for his daughter Wharaurangi. It was published in a number of places in the 19th century, was a favourite among the Rangitane and other tribes from Taranaki southwards. Composed by Te Rangitakoru of Wangaihu for his daughter Wharaurangi, this oriori holds a memory of early exploration retained by Ngāti Apa, Rangitane and South Taranaki peoples. It involves the Aotea and Kuruhaupo waka. J.C. Jock McEwen states that it was once sung by most Māori between Taranaki and Wellington. He sees this as a superior translation to the one published by S. Percy Smith in 1907, of which an excerpt is provided. It tells a foundational story of landscape connection and of early Polynesian introductions of flora and fauna to this land. Interestingly, in both Buick's and McEwen's accounts, the later translated by Pei Te Hurunui Jones, the Whanganui seems already possessed of its name, whereas the rivers further south that he crosses appear as yet unnamed, at least in the mind of Ho. The exception to this is in Bewick's version, which has Ho name the Whanganui as the Great Mouth, sometimes referred to as Big Bay. This is a contradiction of the usual accounts which gives Tamatea the naming honour for that river. The accounts of Ho's naming of other rivers within the Rohe under discussion tell of very similar derivations. Wangaihu is, as Bewick says, a river so close to its bigger neighbour, Ho thought he could splash the water of the Whanganui into it. The Turakinga, thrown down, refers to the fallen tree which Ho threw down to use as a bridge. It is a long trudge to the next river, to the Rangiteke. Day of plodding. More specifically, it has been suggested that this means high stepping by day, a possible reference to the long walk in sand. Both McEwen and Bewick's interpretations refer to the style of walking. The other interpretation of the meaning of the Whanganui is also an act of naming perpetrated by newcomers making their names from the coast, not the interior. This is the story of Tamatea Pōkai Whenua. Tamatea Te Pōkai Whenua. Tamatea Pōkai Whenua. This informs travellers along the coast of crossings they will make, but more fundamentally, Ho's story tells of the Kurahopo and Aotea Waka. It contains the information that Aotea landed at Whenuakura, south of Patia, of the house Rangitahi, and of the karaka and kumara carried in that waka. Ho's sisters are named as is an early ancestor, Tudor. Bewick offers the suggestion that Ho was a tohunga who was refused a passage in either the Takitimu or Kurahopo canoes when they left Hawaii. He therefore made his way to these islands across the stars. There is no suggestion, however, that he is numbered among the Kāuirere. In fact, the Kāuirere stories differ in that they often rooted in the soils of Aotearoa with no previous island of origination. Bewick suggests that this is a rangitane tradition of Ho, but it does not seem to be replicated among the Whanganui people. Symonds quotes a manuscript given by John White to George Gray, the composer being Ngāti Apa's Te Rangitakoru. The key lines for our purposes are: the canoe of Ruatia, Kurahopo, which landed at the mouth of Whenuakura. The house Rangitahi was erected there. The kumara were planted. The karaka was sowed in this district. Ho gathered up the soil in his hands. It is the staff of Tudor which crossed the water. And it is great. It is Whanganui. Stir up the water. It is Wangaihu. The tree fell. It is Turakinga. Stretch out the legs. It is Rangiteke. The obvious question here is, how is it that this waiata seems to be an overlap of Kurahopo and Aotea traditions? The answer seems to be that Kurahopo suffered some mishap, in some stories a shipwreck, and that the people of this waka travelled the last part of their voyage, which may have been within New Zealand coastal waters, in the Aotea. So from the very beginning, both waka traditions are fused, and to an outsider one might say confused. But the subsequent journeys by part of the waka contingent from the north and east of the island to the west. What seems certain, however, is that Kurahopo traditions exist both to the immediate west and the east of the river mouth, true right and left, and that they form part of the early traditions known along this coast. Tamatea. Another significant ancestor is Tamatea Pōkai Whenua, captain of the Takitimu canoe and explorer of the Whanganui River. When entering the river, Tamatea sent his servant ashore to find flax for a topknot, pūtiki. The place where flax was found became known as Te Pūtiki Waranui a Tamatea Pōkai Whenua. Tamatea's famous son, Kahungunu, has a role in the naming, for it was he who is said to have observed that the flax, which kept breaking, was not like the flax known to them as wharanui, which they had found on the east coast. Hearing that Tamatea was in the region, Turi came laden with food to visit Tamatea. Baskets of kumara and taro hinau and aruhi, of preserved rats and pigeons, of bread made from the raupo flour, also roots of the tea, cabbage tree roots, as well as all the other foods obtainable in the new land. According to the Takitimu version of the story, his daughter Tāneora fell in love with and married Tamatea's brother, Uhinga Araki. The marriage gift from Turi and his wife Rongorongo was the great adze Te Awhiorangi. Thus, from the outset of the great East Coast tribe of Ngāti Kahungunu and the Whanganui people united in marriage, quoting Watahoro, downseas tamatia was greeted by Turi of Aotea, who ordered food to be gathered and prepared for tamatia, and then marriage above takes place. In Aotea traditions, however, Te Awhiorangi is bound forever into the Aotea traditions. Tamatia then built a presumably coastal canoe and left his servant at the mouth of the river while he explored upriver. According to some, this event gave rise to its name, Whanganui, from Whanganui meaning the long wait. Others say the name came from Honuia Paparangi and meant Great Harbour. Tamatia's cave on the upper Whanganui above Tawata commemorates his journey upriver, as does Te Ure or Tamatia. Although if the names of these visitors were perpetrated, the question is, who held the memory of these passing visits? Were people already in the vicinity? According to Batley, Tamatia left his son Kahungunu behind on the east coast, making his way inland along the Napier-Taupo Highway, the places where he began to stake his claim using firebrands in the bank and animals he had brought with him, including crayfish, represented in the carving in the Hakapa family's carved house, Orua Matua at Moa Whanau, and a lizard in the forest at Wakatara became named landmarks. It seems that an important source for Batley is the ubiquitous T.W. Downs, and there's a little excerpt in there. Tamawhiro and Tararoa from Te Atiho. When musket-bearing Ngāpuhi first attacked the Whanganui River, one famous account was the Whanganui defenders saying, "Does this man think to conquer Te Atiho with his putatara? Are the descendants of Aokehu and Tamawhiro of Haupipi and Pairangi flying from a sound? We know who the others are, but Tamawhiro, who is he?" He is also referred to in another context, another source. When the ancestors of Te Atiho first came to Awanuiarua, or the Wainui Tarawera, both ancient names for the Whanganui River, they found the moa here. I have told you that the koromiko was the only wood with which that great bird could be thoroughly cooked. Hence the saying, ko te koromiko te rākau I tunua I te moa. The moa belonged to this land, and Ngā Pairangi hunted it before the days of Aokehu with Tamawhiro and Tūmatakōkiri. It is early Māori ethnographer John Wycliffe who offers an insight into this. Tamawhiro, son of Haumanu, was taught the sacred knowledge of the tohunga and proved to be an adept student. He later returned to Hawaii with his wife and children, where he began to impart this sacred knowledge to ordinary people. Enraged, the priests vowed to destroy him, forcing Tamawhiro to take flight in his canoe with his family. When they were attacked, Tamawhiro succeeded in killing their noted chief, Ruawhiti, and captured his famous taiaha, Maramakaiariki, the moon that eats the Lord. He then went on to kill Tai Paritu, the full flood tide, and Tai Ekeroa, the long spring tide, and captured two noted warriors, Titiko, the hawk that cries, and Wera Wera Kahu, warm garment. He also took in this battle the whalebone weapons of war, Parawa, called Kaiate, Purura, Tamawaiwapiu. White writes that Tararoa went to fight Tamawhiro in his pā, Te Korokoro Haumia, but Tamawhiro heard of this and built a retreat pā on Maunga Ariki, Tūngongoroa. While Tararoa managed to attack and kill a number of people, White does not say what the outcome was. A wakapapa from Hawaii, sourced from an old book and published for the descendants resident at Puteki, picks up the Hawaii theme, but with a ho citation, giving the proverb Te uri o Haunui a Paparangi nana I tau tau te nukuroa o Hawaii. The descendants of Haunui a Paparangi who contrived to conquer the length and breadth of Hawaii. Commences from Pairangi down to Takirangi too, who resides at Puteki, notes that these above ancestors are chiefly descendants from Hawaii. Tū Tai Poroporo. There are many accounts of the story of Tūtai Poroporo, perhaps the most famed and feared of the river Taniwha. In Wiri Mukawika's version, Tūtai Poroporo was originally a young shark which was caught and captured by Chief Tuariki of Ngāti Apa. He made a pet of the animal, placing it in a spring and used karakia to help it grow into a taniwha. Gradually, with care, it became huge. Whanganui raiders came and killed Tuariki, carrying his body back home, but pursued by the taniwha. Tūtai Poroporo came right up the river and began to destroy people and homes in considerable numbers up and down the river. His dwelling place was Taumahote, Shakespeare Cliff. Eventually, Tamahua went to his father-in-law Aokihu at Waitotara to ask him to slay the taniwha. This he did by means of a specially constructed box which he hid himself in, and having been devoured by the taniwha, then used karakia and a special knife to cut his way out, killing Tūtai Poroporo in the process. The greenstone is still in our possession that it was slain with. Most claimants believe the story is about relationships hundreds of years ago and being in touch with nature. The Journal of Polynesian Society carries a number of references to Aokihu and Tūtai Poroporo, the taniwha he slayed. Many of these differ in detail if we take two of the most significant sources, namely from Te Anawa of Whanganui and Wiri Mukawika of Ngāroru. And what is agreed in most accounts, there is much overlap of significant points. Tūtai Poroporo was enchanted, a powerful spirit in the form of a young fish who began life outside of the Whanganui River. He eventually found himself in the Whanganui, where he created mayhem for some time. Finally, by skill, courage, and trickery, he was destroyed, not by a specifically Whanganui River hero, but by, significantly, the progenitor of the Whanganui tribes, Aokihu. Downes quotes from an official document witnessed and signed by Ngāti Ruaka Chief Te Anawa and passed to him by Elsden Best. Wiri Mukawika's account, which is more detailed, tells how the taniwha came from Nelson and was brought over to Ngāti Apa territory of the Rangitike as a small shark for a pet. As already noted, it is perhaps significant that while originating from the Bay of Plenty, sections of Ngāti Apa also occupied Te Tau Ihu, the top of the South Island. In the Kawika story, Tamahua, a son-in-law of Aokihu, had married the daughter of Kawika. This is presumably the same Kawika who travelled on the Aotea canoe, named Rakatakapo. Aokihu's granddaughter, Tamahua, was of Whanganui, Rakatakapo of Waitotara. We should note that for Ngāti Pāmoana, Tamahua is Aokihu's brother from Ngā Pairangi Wakapapa. Tamahua was the brother of Tuahua, and his wife was Hinepua. It is noteworthy that the invitation for what amounts to the greatest mythological act of heroism on the river is ascribed by Whanganui and Waitotara tellers alike to the Ngāroru chief, Aokihu. If only because it reminds us, for the purposes of this hearing, of the close associations between these two peoples. Kawika also recounts the karakia apparently used in subduing the taniwha. The Te Anawa account states that the taniwha originated near Lake Rotorua, Ngāti Tūwharetoa country. When Ngāti Apa migrated from the east coast, they stayed at Rotorua for some years, establishing tūpā before being forced out into the Rangitike. What can we take from the fundamental elements of the stories from these two important chiefs, from the Whanganui and Waitotara? We might conclude that the taniwha and his master Tuariki represent something that was foreign and menacing in the Whanganui that could only be destroyed by a great warrior of notable lineage. In other words, Tūtai Poroporo is a representation of the rather too numerous Ngāti Apa, who arrived in the district and pushed their luck too far and were sent packing out of the Whanganui River Valley. Aokihu was a significant ancestor for Whanganui as well as Ngāroru. Aokihu Stream, the first waterway north of Kaiwi, is derived from the name Te Aokihu. So, the story confirms the linkages between Ngāroru and the Whanganui peoples. To be inclusive of main sources, we must mention Best, who in 1899 offers another version in which Aokihu has a need to seek utu from the family of his wife, the Arapawa Island woman, Tākanga Matua, who had insulted him. but Beast's account does not make the connection between his need for utu and the destruction of the taniwha in Whanganui.